Chapter 1. They chose the wrong planet. The first mistake the Hrax Dominion made was not invading Earth. Empires always eventually make that kind of mistake when they have been victorious for too long and memory begins to rot into arrogance. No, their first real mistake was how they studied the planet before they came. The Hrax were a star-faring predator civilization built on clean assumptions, efficient violence, and the proud belief that intelligence naturally rose above environment. Their soldiers wore adaptive carapace armor. Their war doctrine favored rapid atmospheric insertion followed by grid pacification, and their scientists categorized worlds according to industrial resistance, military cohesion, energy output, and infrastructure fragility. Worlds, to them, were systems. Systems could be broken. Morale could be calculated. Resistance could be mapped. Species either had enough technology to threaten the Dominion or they did not. When their remote probes surveyed Earth from deep concealment, the data fit beautifully into Hrax's strategic confidence. One sapient species, uneven political unity, strong military potential but fragmented command chains, dense urban centers vulnerable to orbital suppression, global communication networks that could be crippled by electromagnetic blinding, plenty of water, excellent biomass value, and, crucially, a biosphere the Hrax analysts classified as ecologically noisy but tactically irrelevant. That phrase later entered human military academies as one of the most catastrophic understatements in recorded interstellar warfare. The second mistake was cultural. The Hrax came from a world where evolution had long ago crushed randomness out of open-land survival. Their home biosphere had stabilized under domination by a handful of apex lineages, most of which their ancestors had either exterminated or domesticated before they ever cracked their first moon. To a Hrax commander, the idea that a mature civilization would coexist with large, aggressive, independent animal populations inside or near strategic terrain seemed primitive to the point of embarrassment. In their doctrine manuals, wildlife was an engineering nuisance, no more tactically significant than weather or fungal growth. If local creatures were dangerous, one burned the forests, seeded the wetlands with nerve mists, and proceeded as planned. Earth, on initial glance, looked laughably manageable in that regard. Yes, the atmospheric archives showed millions of animal species, but how many could matter against plasma carbines, kinetic mesh armor, and airborne hunter platforms? The Hrax War Council glanced past entries on crocodilians, megafauna, venomous arthropods, ursids, felids, cetacean cognition, disease vectors, feral swarms, and predatory pack behavior with the same amused impatience one might have for a child pointing nervously at farm dogs before a tank column rolled through. By the time one junior xenobiologist tried to raise a concern about Earth's unusually persistent record of human deaths caused by native fauna despite modern medicine and weapons, the council had moved on to discussing city seizure schedules. The young scientist was told, according to the recovered minutes, if the humans have failed to eradicate their own vermin, that only proves they are less orderly than expected. The first assault wave entered Earth's atmosphere over what had once been called a soft target region. That was another concept the Hrax adored, soft target regions. Not major capitals, not hardened Northern Alliance zones, not missile forests or naval bastions. They chose broad, low-density landmasses and wild reserves where satellite coverage could be blinded with minimal political warning and where human military response, according to their models, would be slower than over urban cores. They expected to establish concealed forward camps, cut local communications, and then expand inward before national governments fully understood the scale of the landings. The opening sites included sections of northern Australia, Central African wetlands, the Siberian taiga, the Amazon basin, and stretches of marshland in the southeastern United States. To the Hrax, these were ideal entry theaters, immense, underpopulated, rich in biomass, and this part mattered most to their confidence far from concentrated human armor. Their troop planners imagined days of hidden staging, sensor tower deployment, and atmospheric acclimatization before the first true engagements with human defenders. Instead, within hours of landing, distress code traffic from 4 invasion sectors went from professional to incoherent. The Northern Australia group died first. The official Hrax record, reconstructed later from helmet logs and emergency battlefield telemetry, shows that Cohort 7 established its landing perimeter with textbook efficiency beside a dry riverbed and low eucalyptus woodland. Scouts deployed in 3 vectors. Automated turrets were raised. Atmospheric filters adapted. One lieutenant made a joke about the heat. Then Private Unit Kerr, 19, assigned to drone retrieval in tall grass beyond the outer beacon arc, vanished in full daylight without triggering a threat warning. His squad found only his rifle and a streak in the dirt leading into a shallow water channel they had classified as non-hazardous. They were still debating whether local insurgents had used optical camouflage when another soldier screamed over comms that something had taken Vec under the mud. Seconds later, the channel erupted into spray and scales as a saltwater crocodile, an organism none of them had given serious tactical attention, hit the waterline with enough force to rip a fully armored Hrax trooper off his feet and twist him sideways into a shape his suit could no longer support. Plasma fire tore the bank apart. The reptile vanished. So did the body. The squad leader demanded aerial thermal. The thermal drone found not one heat signature in the water, but 9. That report, astonishing on its own, might still have been dismissed as freak local hazard if not for what happened over the next 6 hours across the other landing zones. In the southeastern marsh sector, Hrax recon teams moving through dense reeds and warm shallow water reported repeated contact with semi-aquatic ambush entities that struck from below, targeted the legs, and disappeared before retaliation algorithms could lock. Alligators, which the Dominion had classified as low-aggression reptiles, proved astonishingly willing to treat armored invaders as clumsy intruders in contested feeding lanes. In the Amazon drop zone, cutter teams clearing vegetation around a calm mast began experiencing swelling, hallucinations, respiratory collapse, and full system panic from ant swarms, venomous bites, fungal spores, and dart frogs whose toxins required neither malice nor impressive size to become battlefield relevant. One Hrax engineer reportedly died shrieking because a cloud of tiny stinging insects had entered his suit through a cooling vent he never imagined needed hard sealing against wildlife. In Siberia, a reconnaissance cell cutting through forest under snow cover lost 2 members to what they first assumed was remote sabotage, only for the body cam of a third to reveal a huge cat with pale eyes hitting from overhead with such speed the combat system classified the strike as unknown falling object until it was too late. When the surviving trooper radioed command that the trees have predators, his captain accused him of stress corruption and ordered him to maintain formation. Minutes later, the captain himself vanished from a rear position. Later studies suggested a brown bear had investigated the field kitchen heat units, decided the unfamiliar armored bipeds were a problem, and acted with the kind of blunt territorial violence no Hrax simulation had ever bothered to assign to a non-sapient actor. Meanwhile, off the coasts, things were getting worse in ways even Earth's own militaries had not fully predicted. One Hrax stealth skimmer, attempting low-profile insertion into an estuarine mangrove belt in South Asia, reported hull impacts from large aquatic debris. Then the footage showed no debris at all, only dark forms slamming repeatedly into the vessel's underside and sensor vanes. Crocodilians again. Another ship trying to recover a downed scout over Arctic water lost 2 retrieval divers to a pod of orcas who did what orcas had done to vulnerable things since long before humans learned to write. Coordinated, investigated, and killed with unnerving intelligence. On the African interior front, a troop transport that had landed too close to an elephant migration corridor discovered the hard way that a 6-ton mammal in full charge neither respects energy, shielding, nor cares that it is technically obsolete in the age of star travel. The side footage of a panicked Hrax fire team pouring disciplined pulse bursts into a bull elephant that kept coming anyway became one of the earliest viral human war clips because of the horrified commentary from a nearby ranger unit. They brought plasma rifles. One human voice said over the recording, incredulous with savage delight, and they still picked a fight with Africa. By the end of the first day, the Hrax Dominion still had not fought the human military in any serious sense, but it had already lost over 1,100 soldiers, 3 atmospheric landers, 2 sensor towers, 1 mobile command crawler, and a level of confidence from which there would be no full recovery. The battlefield summaries coming up from the surface no longer read like an invasion. They read like punishment delivered by an entire biosphere that had somehow been offended by the presence of off-world arrogance. And through all of it, the humans, those infuriating, adaptive, pattern-hungry creatures the Hrax had actually intended to conquer, were watching, learning, and beginning to smile in a way that would soon make the whole galaxy understand a brutal truth. The invaders had not landed on a human world. They had landed on Earth. And Earth had never belonged to humans alone. Chapter 2. The planet started hunting back. Human governments did not react to the invasion with immediate confidence. That would have been a lie, and lies have a way of becoming visible when orbital ships are burning in the upper atmosphere and entire regions vanish under hostile electronic suppression. The first 8 hours after contact were chaos on a planetary scale. Civilian networks stuttered beneath coordinated interference. Several military satellites were blinded. Emergency cabinets convened under hardened protocols from Washington to Canberra, Brasilia to New Delhi. Nobody knew yet whether the Hrax intended occupation, extermination, or selective strategic seizure. The images coming in from the first landings were patchy and unreal. Burned forest circles, crashed alien craft, missing ranger teams, strange armored bodies in swamp water, livestock scattering through fields under unfamiliar aircraft shadows. But one detail began repeating in report after report with such bizarre consistency that at first many analysts thought it was noise in the data. The invaders were taking casualties before meaningful contact with human forces. Significant casualties. Whole recon elements lost. Camps disrupted. Perimeter drones disabled by environmental interference. Medical triage requests mentioning venom, laceration trauma, parasitic contamination, and blunt force trampling injuries. As that pattern became undeniable, a very strange thing happened at multiple command centers across Earth. The room stopped feeling purely terrified and started feeling alert in a new way, as if the planet itself had just passed them a note. The Australians recognized it first in strategic language, though the Americans won the race to saying it out loud on an intergovernmental call. The phrase reportedly came from a U.S. Marine liaison who had spent part of his youth in Florida and enough of adulthood in joint exercises abroad to understand what he was seeing. He leaned over a table full of digital overlays and said, "Gentlemen, ladies, these idiots just invaded the parts of Earth even humans don't mess with casually." That sentence traveled faster than any official press release, because it was both funny and profoundly accurate. Northern Australia, the Everglades, the Amazon, the Congo wetlands, Arctic predator corridors, the Indian estuaries, mosquito-choked floodplains, saltwater croc territory, lion and leopard ranges, venom belts, cassowary country, shark migration lanes, every one of those had been marked by Hrax strategists as a soft insertion theater. To human soldiers, rangers, biologists, hunters, and every grandparent who had ever warned a child about swimming in the wrong river or walking too casually through tall grass, the selection looked like divine comedy. The joke ended the moment humans understood how to weaponize it. Earth's militaries did not merely defend against the Hrax. They began shaping the invaders' movements deeper into ecological kill zones. Drone reconnaissance, once reoriented through low-frequency hard links the alien jammers struggled to predict, began mapping not just enemy positions, but animal activity, migration patterns, breeding territories, heat stress zones, and disease risk layers. Wildlife agencies, yes. Wildlife agencies were pulled into national defense coordination at a scale never before imagined. Ecologists sat beside generals. Park rangers briefed special forces. Indigenous trackers from Australia, the Amazon basin, North America, Africa, and Siberia were suddenly treated as strategic assets because they knew what moved, where, and why. In one now famous secure meeting, an elderly crocodile expert from northern Queensland reportedly looked at an intelligence photo of a Hrax amphibious platoon establishing a night camp beside a muddy estuary and simply said, "If they put lights near the bank, they're feeding the big one first." He was right. Surveillance watched the estuary boil at 2:17 local time. The Hrax lost 17 troops and finally began classifying crocodilians as priority megafaunal threats. By then it was too late. The Southeastern Marsh War became legend within days. Prax forces there had assumed water routes would let them bypass human roadblocks and move sensor platforms inland under concealment. The United States and local state commands realized almost immediately that the Everglades could serve as something far more useful than defended terrain. It could become a partner. Human units withdrew from some obvious interception lines, opened channels that looked tactically inviting, and used low-flying drones to harass Hrax columns into denser, warmer, more stagnant water where movement slowed and formation discipline broke down. Then the mosquitoes got them. Then the snakes. Then the gators. Then the human snipers. Alien helmet logs recovered later contained growing panic over surface eyes because alligator eyeshine kept appearing at night just beyond thermal clean range, surrounding camps like patient, glowing punctuation. One platoon commander described the swamp as a wet intelligence hostile to occupation. He was killed the next night when his unit retreated from an airboat ambush directly into a sink zone full of half-submerged reptiles attracted by blood, sound, and movement. Humans, listening to the feeds, learned something deliciously useful. Once the Hrax were frightened, they made the same mistake every badly trained prey species makes. They ran unpredictably. On Earth, unpredictability only changed which thing killed you. Africa became worse. The Dominion had selected broad equatorial and southern insertion ranges because they expected sparse mechanized resistance and room to maneuver armor across savanna corridors. They did not sufficiently account for the fact that African ecosystems are built around large beings that consider territory, migration routes, offspring, and sudden noises matters worthy of direct action. Elephants wrecked sensors, transport skids, and temporary field barriers simply by refusing alien geometry the right to exist in places they wanted to walk. Rhinoceroses hit ground vehicles hard enough to flip them where suspension fields were not designed for impact from furious prehistoric tanks with horns. Lions and hyenas harassed wounded stragglers at night, not because they understood war, but because a battlefield spills blood and weakens movement, and evolution has always rewarded those who notice that quickly. But the true killers were less dramatic. Tsetse belts, parasites, heat stroke, thorn scrub tearing cooling membranes. Diseases meeting immune assumptions from another world with all the ancient local enthusiasm of a gate crashing open. Human and allied African militaries exploited every bit of it, driving Hrax logistics into routes where stress and biological burden multiplied. In one Kenyan after-action report, a commander wrote, with very controlled professionalism, enemy heavy infantry continue underestimating the combined operational effect of buffalo temperament and 43 degrees Celsius midday exposure. It became required reading in at least 3 war colleges. South America brought terror of a different kind. The Amazon does not kill with grand spectacle unless it feels theatrical. Most of the time it kills by making certainty expensive. The Hrax found their sensors degraded by moisture, heat, leaf density, insects, fungal bloom, and the sheer layered complexity of living things too small and too numerous to classify quickly. Human special operations teams operating with local guides and environmental scientists began drawing alien patrols into seemingly manageable zones where every branch concealed a decision problem. Venomous bites turned minor breaches into nervous system crises. River crossings produced piranha feeding frenzies on wounded troops. Bullet ants caused panic spirals among soldiers who had never imagined pain that disproportionate could come from something so tiny. Poison dart frogs contaminated supply surfaces and med patches. Monkeys, for reasons no serious strategic model ever fully explained, became recurring saboteurs once alien camps introduced shiny equipment and easy theft opportunities. One Hrax quartermaster lost an entire encrypted field deck to a Capuchin troop and was later executed by his own command for allowing strategic assets to be carried into the canopy by local scavengers. Humans, reviewing the incident, promoted the relevant jungle unit commander and named the troop Unofficial Auxiliary Irregulars. By the 3rd week, human media, once the initial panic phase passed and governments realized morale could be built from the truth without inventing heroics, began openly telling the story of Earth as co-combatant. Broadcasts showed crocodiles sliding beneath alien pontoons, cassowaries kicking through recon screens, bears ripping open food caches, ravens leading stranded human scouts toward hidden enemy dead, dolphins and whales disrupting coastal insertion lines with behavior that marine biologists spent months trying and failing to explain cleanly. Some stories were exaggerated, of course. War always breeds myths at light speed. Not every shark attack was tactically relevant. Not every wolf encounter deserved a song. But enough of them were real that the mythology did not drift far from fact. Schoolchildren on 5 continents began drawing posters that said things like "Earth fights dirty" and "Respect the locals" over pictures of snakes, bears, and very angry geese. That last one, embarrassingly for everyone involved, came after a viral video of HFY infantry trying to secure a suburban Canadian reservoir and being repeatedly routed by nesting geese whose species profile had been filed under small avian nuisance. The footage of heavily armed extraterrestrial soldiers stumbling backward under flapping wings and unreasoning territorial fury did more for global morale than some governments' entire strategic communication divisions. The HFY adapted, but never fast enough. That was the hidden genius of Earth's wildlife as an ally. It did not need orders, and therefore could not be fully predicted through command modeling. Human militaries became better and better at recognizing patterns and nudging battles toward them, but they could never script the biosphere entirely either. Wildlife remained wild. It acted from hunger, defense, territory, curiosity, agitation, instinct, disruption, and ancient local logic. That made it tactically infuriating for the invaders because every countermeasure had to be broad enough to handle constant uncertainty while still fighting actual human soldiers. Seal every cooling seam against insects. Overheat faster. Burn back the vegetation. Reveal yourself to drone strikes and local artillery. Avoid waterways. Lose mobility and die of heat. Travel only by day. Enter human sight lines and predator rest cycles shift. Travel only by night. Become a buffet for eyeshine and mosquitoes and things with better hearing than your sensors. Every adaptation carried cost, and Earth was patient in the way only a planet with billions of non-human stakeholders can be. Then the human generals did something even crueler. They started naming operations after animals. Operation Saltjaw, Operation Cassowary Line, Operation Blackwater Teeth, Operation Red Ant Spiral. Most of these were classified, but the names leaked because humans are physically incapable of resisting dark humor in war. Soon HFY's signal decrypt teams began seeing references to crocodile corridors, wolf screens, hornet fronts, and encouraged bear contact in intercepted chatter. They first thought it was code. Often it was not. That realization damaged morale more than bombardment. Soldiers can tolerate superior firepower. They can even adapt to savage climates. What they struggle to endure is the feeling that the entire living world has been briefed against them. And as the months passed, the galaxy watched a truth it had never had to consider before. Humanity was not winning alone. Humanity was winning because it belonged to a death world so ecologically over-engineered by evolution that invading it without deep biological respect amounted to tactical suicide. The HFY had come to conquer one intelligent species. Instead, they had started a war with oceans, swamps, deserts, jungles, ice, Chapter
insects,
3.
Microbes,
Things humans had learned to
reptiles,
fear.
birds,
By the time
mammals,
the war entered
and
its
one
second
stubborn
year,
ape
the HFY
civilization
high command
smart
had
enough
stopped
to
pointing
treating
all of it
Earth's
in the same
biosphere
direction.
as a
The
battlefield
massacre had
complication
indeed begun
and started
It
classifying
just wasn't
it
humans
as an
getting
active
massacred the
strategic
way the
actor.
Dominion had planned.
That should have sounded ridiculous.
Chapter 3.
On
The
any
things humans
reasonable
had
world,
learned to fear.
it would have been
By the
ridiculous.
time the war entered
But
its
reason
second
had
year,
already
the
died
HFY high
in
command
too
had
many
stopped
mangrove
treating Earth's
swamps,
biosphere
deserts,
as a battlefield
forests,
complication
tidal flats,
and started
and
classifying
suburban water
it as an
retention
active
ponds for the
strategic
phrase
actor.
to sound
That should have
absurd
sounded
anymore.
ridiculous.
New HFY's
On any
doctrine
reasonable
manuals
world,
issued in
it would have been
emergency
ridiculous.
revision
Used
but
language
reason
no
had already
Dominion
died
soldier
in too
had
many
ever
mangrove
expected to see.
swamps,
All
deserts,
local fauna
forests,
above micro
tidal
level
flats,
threat
and
classification
suburban water
are to be
retention
considered
ponds for the
functionally
phrase
hostile.
to sound absurd
Assume
anymore.
cross-domain
New
opportunism.
HFY's doctrine
Assume
manuals
environmental
issued in
intelligence
emergency
support
revision
by native
used
sapiens.
language no
Assume
Dominion
injury
soldier
compounds
had ever expected to
exponentially
see.
in unsterile
All local
biospheres.
fauna above
The revisions
micro-level
help
threat
little.
classification
Not enough.
are to be considered
Because if there is one
functionally
thing more
hostile.
difficult
Assume
than learning to
cross-domain
fight an
opportunism.
unfamiliar enemy,
Assume
it is
environmental
learning to fight
intelligence
the same
support by
things
native
the enemy
sapiens.
has been learning
Assume
not to
injury
die from for
compounds
millions of years.
exponentially
in
Humans,
unsterile
of
biospheres,
course,
had their
the
own
revisions
long
helped a
and
little.
often
Not
embarrassing
enough.
history.
Because
with
if there
Earth's
is one
wildlife,
thing more
that
difficult
was precisely
than learning
why
to
they
fight an
proved so
unfamiliar
effective
enemy,
once they
it is learning
decided
to
to stop
stop
treating
treating
those
things
lessons
the
as
enemy
background
has been
culture
learning not to
and start
die
integrating
from
them
for
into
millions
war
of
plans.
years.
Every
Humans,
national
of
military
course,
on Earth
had their
already
own
had
long
survival
and often
schools,
embarrassing
environmental
history with
hazard
Earth's
training,
wildlife.
parasite
That was
avoidance
precisely
doctrine,
why they
bite
proved so
protocols,
effective
weather
once they
adaptation,
decided to
and
stop
ranger
treating
traditions
those lessons
embedded
as background
somewhere in its
culture
structure
and start integrating
Hunters,
them into war
fishers,
Every
farmers,
national
forest
military on
communities,
Earth already had
indigenous
survival
nations,
schools,
wildlife
environmental
biologists,
hazard training,
park wardens,
parasite
herders,
avoidance doctrine,
veterinarians,
bite protocols,
emergency
weather
medics,
adaptation,
rural kids
and ranger
who grew up
traditions
knowing which
embedded
sounds
somewhere
in the dark
in its structure
meant trouble. Human
Hunters,
civilization
fishers,
had always
farmers,
contained distributed
forest
libraries
communities
of practical
indigenous
terror.
nations.
The Fracks had
Wildlife
assumed these were
biologists,
quaint local
park wardens,
knowledges,
herders,
interesting only
veterinarians,
to anthropologists,
emergency medics,
and people wearing
rural
too
kids
much
who
camouflage.
grew up knowing which
They did not
sounds in the
understand
dark
that on
meant
Earth,
trouble. Human
things that will kill
civilization
you if
had
you get
always
complacent
contained
form one of the
distributed
most
libraries
basic
of practical
educational
terror.
categories.
The
in
Fracks
human
had
life.
assumed these were
Humanity
quaint
had
local
not
knowledges,
conquered its biosphere,
interesting
because
only
no
to
one truly
anthropologists
conquers a
and
place
people
like
wearing
Earth.
too much
Humanity had
camouflage.
survived it
They did
through
not
memory,
understand that
caution,
on Earth,
things that will
adaptation,
kill you
and
if
the
you
very
get complacent
old habit of
form one of the
telling
most
one another
basic
what not to
educational
touch,
categories
where not to
in
swim,
human life.
what not to step
Humanity
near,
had not
and what to
conquered
do
its
if something
biosphere
big with
because
teeth
no one
or
truly
venom
conquers
or
a place
unreasonable
like Earth.
attitude decides
Humanity
you have
had
made a
survived
mistake.
it through
That
memory,
memory became
caution,
military currency.
adaptation.
The
And
Australian
very old
theaters
habit of
showed it
telling
with
one
brutal
another
clarity.
what not to touch.
Once the
where not
first
to
Fracks
swim,
landings
what
turned
not to
into
step near,
reptilian horror
and what to
stories,
do if something
Earth
big
Command
with teeth
partnered
or venom
openly
or
with
unreasonable
aboriginal
attitude
trackers,
decides you have made a
outback
mistake.
pilots,
That
ecologists,
memory
and
became
special
military
operations
currency.
units to create
The Australian
what one
theaters
reporter later
showed it
called
with
brutal
weaponized
clarity.
local common
Once
sense.
the first Fracks
Human
landings
teams
turned
learned
into
to move where
reptilian
the
horror
crocodiles
stories.
would not be.
Earth Command
To bait the
partnered
invaders
openly
toward
with
water
aboriginal
access points
trackers
they would choose,
outback
because
pilots,
thirsty
ecologists,
occupiers
and
always
special
made the
operations
same
units
map
to
errors,
create what
and to
one
predict
reporter
how
later
alien
called
camps would
weaponized
respond
local
once
common
fear
sense.
of the rivers set in.
Human
Then the
teams
snakes
learned to
started
move
doing
where
their
the
share.
crocodiles would not
Australia
be.
had
To
never
bait
lacked
the invaders
enthusiasm
toward
in
water
that department.
access points they would
Taipans,
choose,
brown
because
snakes,
thirsty
tiger
occupiers
snakes
always
creatures
made
humans
the same map
respected,
errors,
feared,
and to predict
and
how
very
alien
much
camps
preferred
would
not to
respond
discuss
once fear
while
of the
putting on
rivers set
boots
in the dark.
Then the snakes
The
started
Fracks,
doing their
who had
share.
initially
Australia
assumed
had
small
never
venomous
lacked
life
enthusiasm
was
in that
doctrinal
department.
notice.
Taipans,
Began losing
brown
perimeter
snakes,
teams at a pace
tiger snakes
so
creatures
ugly that
humans
med units
respected,
requested
feared,
emergency
and
toxin
very much
studies
preferred
from
not to
captured human
discuss
field kits
while putting on boots
the problem
in the dark.
they discovered
The
too
Fracks,
late, who had
was that
initially
many
assumed
Australian
small
dangers are
venomous
not
life
lethal
was beneath
because they are
doctrinal
large
notice,
or obvious.
began losing
They
perimeter
are lethal
teams at a
because
pace
they are efficient,
so ugly that
patient,
med units
and rude
requested
enough to
emergency
occupy the
toxin
exact
studies
spaces
from captured
careless
human
beings
field
want to
kits.
use.
In
The
one
problem
notorious
they discovered
incident,
too late
an entire
was that
Fracks
many
forward
Australian
observation
dangers
squad
are not
abandoned
lethal
because they are large
defensible
or
rocky
obvious.
rise after
They are
3
lethal because they are
nights
efficient,
of unexplained panic
and
symptoms,
rude enough to occupy the
hallucinations,
exact
and one
spaces
fatal
careless
bite.
beings want to
Human
use.
scouts taking
In
the
one
position
notorious
afterward
incident,
found not
an
sabotage,
entire Fracks
not
forward
gas,
observation
not
squad abandoned
psychotropic
a
residue,
perfectly
just a
defensible
colony of
rocky
venomous
rise
spiders
after
thriving
3 consecutive
beautifully
nights
in the invasive
of unexplained
heat
panic
the aliens
symptoms
had installed.
hallucinations.
North America
and one fatal
contributed
bite.
its own
Human
flavors
scouts
of
taking the
punishment.
position
Wolves were
afterward
less
found not
tactically
useful than
not
human
gas,
storytellers
not
sometimes
psychotropic
pretended,
residue,
but not
just a
irrelevant.
colony of
They
venomous
harried the
spiders,
wounded,
thriving
exposed
beautifully
poorly
in the
managed
invasive
kill
heat
sites,
sinks the
and in
aliens
northern
had
forests
installed.
often detected
North America
Fracks movement
contributed
before
its
ground
own
sensors
flavors
did,
of punishment,
which mattered
Wolves
because
were less
humans had
tactically
enough
useful
biologists
than
and
hunters
hunters
on
storytellers
comms
sometimes
to
pretended,
interpret disturbed
but not
pack
irrelevant.
behavior.
They
as
harried the
meaningful data.
wounded. Bears
Exposed
proved more
poorly
directly
managed
kill
kill
sites.
The
And in
Dominion
northern
had assumed
forests often
apex terrestrial
Fracks
omnivores
movement
would
before
avoid
ground
technologically
sensors did,
superior
which mattered
intruders
because humans
after an
had
initial
enough
learning
biologists
period.
and hunters
This turned out to be
on comms
untrue.
to interpret
Anywhere
disturbed
food,
pack behavior,
noise,
as meaningful
cubs,
data,
or
territorial
proved more
insult
directly
intersected.
memorable.
Grizzlies
The
in
Dominion
particular
had
developed
assumed
what
apex
internal
terrestrial
Fracks memos
omnivores would
described
avoid
as an
technologically
operationally
superior intruders
unacceptable
after an an
tendency
initial
toward
learning
close
period.
quarters assault.
This turned out to
Alaska
be untrue,
and
and Canada
food,
turned those findings
noise,
into doctrine.
cubs,
Human
or
units
territorial
began
insult
dumping false
intersected.
ration traces,
Grizzlies in
and
particular
damaged protein
developed what
canisters
internal
and routes
Hrax
they
memos
knew the aliens
described
would clear
as
an
a secure,
operationally
after drone
unacceptable
screening.
tendency.
You could not
toward
rely on
close
a
quarters
bear.
assault. Of course,
Alaska
war is
and
not
Canada
a cartoon,
turned those
but you did
findings
not
into
need
doctrine.
certainty.
Human
Human
units
units
began
began
probability
dumping
that
false
a
ration
frightened,
traces,
hungry,
and damaged
enraged
protein canisters
half-ton
and routes
native
they
tank
knew
might
the
arrive
aliens
at
would
exactly
clear
the
as
wrong
secure
moment after
and
drone
turn a
screening.
disciplined
You could not
withdrawal
rely
into
on a
panic
bear.
noise.
Of course,
Earth was full
war
of
is not a
wrong
cartoon,
moments waiting to be
but you did
invited.
not need certainty.
The oceans
You
became the
needed
true
enough
terror
probability
zones.
that a
At
frightened,
first, the
hungry,
Hrax tried to
enraged
reclaim
half-ton
strategic
native
momentum
tank
through
might
maritime
arrive at
operations,
exactly the wrong
reasoning
moment
correctly
and turn
that
a
Earth's
disciplined
seas covered
withdrawal
most of the
into
planet
panic noise.
and incorrectly
Earth
that
was
water
full
would
of
dilute
wrong
the
moments waiting to
biosphere's
be invited.
hostility the way
The
open
oceans
became the true other conquest worlds. At first, they pushed hard into literal strategic momentum using stealth maritime operations, amphibious correctly that Earth seas covered most of the planet to hit incorrectly that water would dilute the biosphere's hostility. For several weeks, it almost worked. Had on other human navies were stretched. They pushed hard into literal strike zones, and ocean warfare always favors those willing to be cruel at scale. And wave-skimming then marine intelligence to hit under civilian oceanographers and supply fishermen's networks. For several weeks, old Coast Guard institutions, human navies were stretched into command. Orbital war remained volatile. The fracks had no language for what warfare always favors territories became monitored denial belts. Then marine intelligence around critical civilian oceanographers began behaving fishermen's networks, researchers and old Coast Guard institutions combat started feeding patterns into command. Damaged alien the fracks had no language for what repeated coordinated Great White territories became monitored denial belts. And in two confirmed populations around critical northern waters predators began behaving in ways human missiles still had already opened. But combat in tropical waters, saltwater crocodiles, alien tiger sharks, experienced jellyfish blooms, coordinated venomous reef species, sensor mass and simple microbial contamination cases turned full every emergency predators exploited breaches human missiles had already opened. In tropical waters, saltwater crocodiles destroyed off tiger the Indonesian archipelago. Jellyfish blooms. The water here contains species many independent microbial contamination meaningful turned every emergency ocean landing. Human admirals framed that one Hrax marine captain around fleet shortly before his transport group even birds got involved off the Indonesian because Earth refuses dignity. The water here contains too military history like hostiles to remain a meaningful and giant for tactical surprise. It is less good at making human admirals frame that line. Very angry territorial birds. Command from yet morale. The war generated even enough birds avian incidents because Earth refuses dignity in its methods. In urban and military history zones learn to follow Hrax and giant predators. And it is less good at making monuments to flocks of very angry territorial ruined optics. Yet the war generated enough mass casualty concealment into a impossible fantasy. Corvids and urban nested semi-communication towers learned to follow maintenance scavenging teams. Cassowaries in northern Australia ration cassowaries always do when some bright fool mistakes the jungle for a mass casualty concealment. Geese especially geese became legendary because they embodied communication towers and attacked maintenance climbers. Here was a species not cassowaries in northern Australia did what cassowaries not always do, not self-right fool, not especially intelligent by military standards. And yet geese especially territorial became legendary because they embodied perimeter was compromised by the simple fact that here was a species not large enough to count fire posture while being not venomous, flapping, not screaming, not especially intelligent by military standards. And yet human so committed to territorial offense that more than one psychological perimeter was compromised by the simple fact shouted during a chaotic battle near the Great Lakes, full fire posture, where the Canadians while being mobbed by second flock, screaming. There was no unreasoning malice from half the Hrax front shifted anyway. Human infantry, disease and parasites finished weaponized this psychologically. The Hrax had advanced medicine, one sergeant shouted during a chaotic battle near the Great Lakes, an adaptive immune where the Canadians will release for a dozen conquest biomes. There was no second flock. None of that mattered enough on half the Hrax front Earth shifted does not anyway. Merely host disease and parasites layers of spectacle biochemical grudge. The Hrax had advanced fungal infections that excellent battlefield stabilization, bacteria that rode immune scaffolds into bloodstream for a dozen waterborne parasites. None of that mattered enough on Earth. Leeches, Earth does not merely host life. Nematodes, it hosts layers of ancient invisible republics of microscopic fungal infections that learn to negotiate with through soap. Bacteria that rode cuts, boiling bloodstreams, filters, waterborne generations of local advice. Tick-borne fevers. The invaders could treat individual cases, mites, nematodes. What they could not do was eliminate the republics of microscopic hunger that humans learned to negotiate every ecosystem. Had 10 small ways to punish prolonged occupation. And generations of wildlife did not need to kill. The invaders could treat individual cases. It only needed to keep enough of them. What they could not do was eliminate the constant distraction cost of inhabiting a world where almost every ecosystem or psychologically brittle that the human military better armed. Earth's wildlife did not need to kill now fully every adapted to biospheric partnership. It only needed to keep enough of them sleepless. And through all of it, the humans kept learning too. Feverish, that was perhaps the most dangerous part for the invaders. Or psychologically commanders did not romanticize the biosphere into increasingly united ally and now fully adapted to biospheric partnership could they studied weakness, updated, and through all adjusted with the humans kept learning too. When crocodile encounters became predictable for the invaders, they built route models. Human commanders did not romanticize the biosphere into a fairy tale ally. They recalibrated probabilities. While animals when certain insect bloom cycles could interfere with Hrax and adjusted with with
tactics,
ruthless
they
humility.
timed offensives
When
accordingly.
crocodile encounters
When local
became
fauna
predictable,
became stressed
they built
by battle
route models.
activity in
When
ways
bear
that
incidents
endangered
proved
civilians
useful
too,
but unreliable,
they shifted settlements and
recalibrated
established
probabilities.
protected corridors.
When certain
Because
insect
Earth's alliance with
cycles could
humanity
interfere
was
with
not
Frax's
ownership,
thermal
it
optics,
was
they
coexistence
timed
under
offensives
pressure.
accordingly.
This mattered
When local
morally
fauna
and
became
tactically.
stressed
The
by
Frax
battle
kept trying to
activity
dominate
in
the
ways that
biosphere
endangered
as if it were
civilians
conquered
too.
territory.
They shifted
Humans
settlements
kept behaving
and
like
established
residents who had
protected
grown up
corridors
knowing the
because
neighbors
Earth's
were
alliance
dangerous
with humanity
and deserved respect.
was not ownership.
In a
It
war of
was
adaptation,
coexistence under
that
pressure.
difference grew fatal.
This mattered morally
By the
and
time
tactically.
Dominion analysts
The Frax
finally
kept trying to
concluded
dominate
that
the
Earth's
biosphere
wildlife
as
could
if it
no
were
longer
conquered
be
territory.
treated as incidental.
Humans kept behaving
the old
like
phrase had
residents who had
already
grown up
passed
knowing
into
the
human
neighbors were
frontline
dangerous
slang.
and deserved
If it
respect.
lives here, in a
Soldiers
war of
would say,
adaptation, it probably
difference
hates
grew
the
fatal.
enemy.
That
By
was
the
an
time Dominion
exaggeration.
analysts finally
Naturally,
concluded
nature
that
does
Earth's
not take
wildlife
sides in
could
the
no
sentimental
longer be
human
treated
sense.
as
But
incidental.
Earth,
The old
through
phrase had already
venom,
passed
claw,
into human frontline
disease,
slang.
swarm.
If it lives
charge,
here,
soldiers
migration,
would say,
and
it
territorial
probably
fury
hates the enemy.
had still made its
That was an
position
exaggeration,
unmistakably
naturally.
clear. The
Nature
planet
does
was
not
not take
neutral.
sides in the
And for the
sentimental human
invaders,
sense.
that meant the
But
massacre
Earth,
was
through
only
tooth,
accelerating.
Venom,
Chapter
claw,
4.
disease,
The day the Dominion
swarm,
broke.
charge,
Empires do
migration,
not collapse
and
at the moment
territorial
they
fury
become doomed.
had still made
They
its
collapse
position
when enough
unmistakably
people
clear.
inside them
The
realized
planet
doom
was
has
not
become
neutral.
more likely
And
than
for the
victory,
invaders, and start
that meant
making
the
decisions
massacre was
accordingly.
only accelerating.
For the Frax Dominion,
Chapter 4.
that point came
The
not
day
at
the
the
loss
loss
of their
first landing
Empires
waves,
do
nor
not
the
collapse
humiliation
at the
of their
moment
March
they become
campaigns.
doomed.
Nor
They
even
collapse
the burning
when
of their
enough
ocean
people
strike
inside
groups
them realize
under
doom
combined
has become
human
more
naval
likely
pressure
than
and
victory
marine predation
and start
chaos.
making decisions
It came when the internal
For the Frax
military
Dominion,
review board
that
issued
point
a
came not at the
classified
loss of
assessment
their first
stating that
landing
Earth
wave,
was
nor the
ecologically
humiliation of their March
non-subduable
campaigns,
within acceptable
nor even the
imperial
burning
cost
of their ocean
thresholds.
strike groups
That
under
phrase,
combined
dry
human
as
naval
bone,
pressure
was
and
the
marine
bureaucratic
predation
version
chaos.
of a scream.
It came when the
It meant the
internal
Dominion
military
could
could
no
no
longer
longer
assume
assume
that
that
every
every
month
month
of
of
occupation
occupation
would
would
improve
improve
its
its
position.
ecologically
On Earth,
non-subduable
every month of
within
occupation
acceptable
made
imperial
things
cost
worse.
thresholds.
More soldiers adapted.
That phrase,
The humans
dry as
adapted
bone,
faster.
was the
New armor
bureaucratic
seals,
version of a scream.
new fungal breaches.
It meant the
Better
Dominion
march
could no
discipline,
longer
more
assume
heat
that casualties
every month of
inland,
occupation would
aerial
improve its
supremacy,
position.
bird
On
strike
Earth,
swarms
every
around
month of
low-altitude
occupation
systems
made things worse.
Plus human
More
anti-air
soldiers
networks
adapted.
refined
The
through
humans
local terrain.
adapted faster.
Deep jungle
New
denial,
armor seals,
supply collapse,
new fungal breaches,
Arctic pressure,
better marsh
predator,
discipline,
weather,
more heat
and
casualties
mechanical
attrition.
attrition.
Urban
Aerial
seizure,
supremacy,
rats,
bird strike
disease,
swarms around
crows,
low-altitude
sabotage,
systems,
and human
plus
insurgents
human
who
anti-air
understood their
networks
own
refined
city
through local
ecologies
terrain.
like a second
Deep
bloodstream.
jungle denial,
It was not merely
supply
that Earth was
collapse,
costly.
Arctic pressure,
It was that Earth
predator,
behaved like a
weather,
strategic
and mechanical
wound that would
attrition.
not stop
Urban
infecting
seizure,
the hand
rats,
trying to close
disease,
around it.
crows,
The Dominion War
sabotage,
throne
and
responded
human
in the
insurgents
only
who
way
understood
failing
their
empires
own city
ever do,
ecologies like a
by
second
escalating
bloodstream.
into theatrical
It was not merely
cruelty.
that Earth was
If
costly.
direct pacification
It was that Earth
could not
behaved
secure
like
the
a
planet,
strategic
then
wound
terror
that would not stop
Orbital
infecting
glassing
the
proposals
hands
trying to
surfaced,
close around
then
it.
were rejected
The
because
Dominion
Earth's
War throne
biosphere
responded
value
in the
and
only
industrial
way
capture
failing
potential
empires
remained
ever
too
do.
high.
By
Instead, the
escalating
Frax
into
launched
theatrical
the
cruelty.
purity advance
If direct
A,
pacification
concentrated
could not
planetary
secure the
campaign
planet,
aimed at
then terror
crushing
would.
human morale
Orbital
through
glassing
synchronized
proposals
devastation of
then were
agricultural
rejected because
belts,
Earth's
freshwater
biosphere value
systems,
and
and
industrial
population
capture
centers
potential
adjacent
remained
to
too
major
high.
wildlife
Instead, the
corridors.
Frax
They
launched the
assumed
purity
humans would be
advance
forced
A,
to pull back from
concentrated
wilderness
planetary
integrated
campaign
warfare,
aimed at
once
crushing
the cost
human
to
morale
civilian
through
infrastructure
synchronized
became severe
devastation
enough.
of
In
agricultural
strategic
belts.
theory,
It
freshwater
was brutal
systems, but
and
rational.
population
In
centers
practice,
adjacent
it
to
forced
major
the final
wildlife
alignment
corridors.
of Earth into
They
something the
assumed
Dominion
humans would
should
be
have
forced to
feared
pull
from the
back
beginning.
from wilderness
Full
integrated
species
warfare
total defense.
once the cost
Rural
to
communities
civilian infrastructure
with
became
astonishing
severe
speed.
enough. In strategic theory,
under
it was
military
brutal
escort.
but rational. Conservation
In practice,
agencies
it
merged
forced the
operationally
final
with
alignment of
defense
Earth into
departments,
something the
and
Dominion
entire
should have
regions
feared from the
shifted
beginning.
into planned
Full species
ecological
total
war
defense.
zones.
Rural
Humans stopped
communities
asking whether
emptied
nature
with
could help them.
astonishing speed.
They began actively
Livestock
designing
moved under
campaigns around
military
how to
escort.
deny the invaders
Conservation
any
agencies
environment
merged
that was not
operationally
already
with
hostile.
defense departments. floodplains were
an
opened.
entire region
Controlled burns
shifted
redirected
into planned
movement
ecological
into predator
war
belts.
zones.
Humans
Minefields
stopped
were laid
asking
not
whether
where
nature could
maps
help them.
looked neat,
They began
but where
actively
panicked
designing
alien troops
campaigns
would
around how
naturally
to
retreat
deny
from
the invaders
stampedes,
any environment
swarms,
that
or
was
brush
not
fire.
already hostile.
In some places,
Floodplains
human
were opened.
soldiers barely
Controlled
saw the
burns
enemy before
redirected
the enemy
movement
was
into
already
predator
being chewed
belts.
apart by the
Minefields were laid
consequences of
not
entering
where
the
maps
wrong
looked
valley
neat,
at the wrong
but where
season.
panicked
And
alien
others
troops would
brutal
naturally
close
retreat
warfare
from
stampedes,
but always with
swarms,
Earth
or
pressing
brush
one
fire.
thumb
In some
invisibly on the
places,
scale.
human soldiers
The Dominion
barely
called
saw
it
the
barbaric.
enemy before the
Human
enemy
commanders
was already
called it
being
integrated
chewed apart
defense.
by the consequences
Schoolchildren
of
watching
entering the
delayed
wrong
news
valley
clips
at the wrong
called it
season.
what it felt
And
like.
others,
The planet
brutal
fighting
close
back.
warfare
The
raged.
Battle of
But
Kruger
always
Rift
with Earth
ended started the Southern Campaign and broke the Dominion psychologically. The Dominion called it Command had gathered human commanders called it integrated push through a hardpan corridor. School children watching delayed news clips, believing they could finally force a decisive mechanized victory. If they stayed out of Kruger rifts, ended the Southern Campaign, forest exposure, and broke the Dominion psychologically. Armored coherence. Crack's command had gathered one last. The plan was sound by normal through a hardpan corridor in Southern Africa. Unfortunately for them, believing they could finally force a decisive mechanized human intelligence, if they stayed out of wetlands for weeks, minimized park authorities, exposure, local communities, maintained military planners, and wildlife migration. The plan was sound by normal operations cell with data. Unfortunately for them, normal standards were no longer. The Dominion column, human intelligence under drone overwatch and excellent park authorities, discipline. Local human artillery, military planners, and wildlife anti-armor units countered well. A joint operation the first elephant herds hit the western flank, not bordered on prophecy, but the Dominion column entered the rift under drone smoke channels. Humans had designed specifically to make the rift human artillery engaged from anything large. Crack's anti-armor units countered pressure. Then the first elephant herds hit the western floodgate release from old agricultural but diverted and panicked. Then lions shaping through the smoke channels. Humans had designed airborne human hunter-killers to make the rift feel smart munitions anything large. Smart. Then buffalo broke the med caravan. The eastern side bog everything sudden floodgate release. A surviving Crack's commander described the battle as then lions executed by the wounded rear. The phrase became famous human hunter-killers more accurate smart munitions into the stalled center. The last great Dominion broke the med caravan beneath the Pacific. Then everything dissolved. They had held back a surviving Crack's commander described preserving it from the grinding ecological humiliation on the surface. The phrase became famous because nothing more overwhelming ever said. At Earth's navel, the last great Dominion fleet if they could shatter human blue water logistics. They had held back a reserve armada finally become winnable. Preserving it from the strike began ecological humiliation on the surface from dark approach vectors. One clean, human screens were stretched at Earth's orbital debris and fell in flaming curtains. If they could shatter for 13 hours, the oceans belonged to the invaders more than they had at any time since the war began. The strike began brilliantly. Then the coalition undersea grids surged from dark approach decoy swarms spread. Human screens were damaged. Tracks, orbital debris fell surfacing in panics because something large was 13 hours the oceans belonged to the invaders more than they had at any time since the war began. Later analysts then the coalition endlessly over how much of the Pacific decoy swarms to orca behavior and damaged how much the human naval shape started surfacing and how much to pure because something large was repeatedly it did not slamming their hulls what from mattered below was the whenever propulsion alien marine crews abandoned flooding craft endlessly over how much of the Pacific defeat owed and white orca behavior under a sky how much to human naval strike aircraft and how much the symbolism alone shattered recruitment it did not matter. In what mattered was the footage. By the war's final crews abandoning no flooding craft into waters full of black whole continents had become interlocking theaters of sky packed with human military force. The symbolism alone shattered recruitment and the old brutality of Earth's ecosystems merged by the war's final strategic personality. Earth no longer the fracks still held pockets. It looked angry. Bunkers whole continents had become interlocking but every victory they gained rotted where human military force, pressure, civilian no resting ground stayed and the old brutality no of supply cache remained merged into one no wounded extraction when unharried. The fracks still held soldiers became liabilities and orbital because Earth's scavengers but every victory they gained were relentless enough to turn battlefield sanitation no resting ground stayed secure. Human propaganda no supply cache remained hidden by then. No posters showed a crocodile beneath murky even water. Dead soldiers became liabilities to local because Earth's scavengers naval morale patches were relentless enough with to turn battlefield sanitation badgers into combat helmets. Human propaganda the slogan "Air superiority" is a poster showed a crocodile famously unauthorized special forces emblem of a mosquito carrying the caption "Naval morale patches featured orcas." The jokes mattered because jokes are how humans metabolize terror. Geese under the slogan "Air superiority" surrendered. Did not happen on Earth, and one famously unauthorized special no empire wants to kneel on the world carrying the caption "Earth's instead apex predator." After a final succession struggle because jokes are how humans metabolize triggered by casualty disclosure leaks. The Dominion surrender transmitted conditional withdrawal. They could not bear that. Fortress Moon. No empire wants to kneel on the world. They offered ceasefire, prisoner exchange. Instead, reparations negotiation and recognition of Earth as a sovereign deaf world triggered by casualty disclosure. That last phrase made human transmitted conditional withdrawal terms from a fortress because the galaxy had always known Earth was a death ceasefire, The difference now was that the reparations had learned what those words and recognition of Earth as a sovereign negotiators world accepted the surrender only after total evacuation of occupied regions enough to require full disclosure of contamination because the galaxy had always known war had lasted 3 years. The difference now was that the Dominion had learned by the end of words actually the Hrax Dominion was human negotiators accepted the surrender only after total evacuation of its army had been broken not just by human strategy, but by being forced to admit that an entire living planet could not be occupied like a machine. By the end of it, after the Hrax Dominion memorials still technically off-world observers, but no longer a serious statues of soldiers. Its army had been broken not just by human strategy, but by image of unified humanity that an entire living planet could not be occupied like a machine. Some of those existed after the war, but across the memorials surprised many of the most visited memorials were strange. They expected a bronze crocodile at Darwin Harbor beside the names of civilians and maybe that evacuated image of unified humanity. Standing elephant mother and calf carved into black stone in South Africa, but across with a dedication to all non-human visited memorials were stranger, and all non-human crocodile at Darwin Harbor beside the names of civilians etched with the names of human dead beneath a shifting projection of elephant mother and just above the waterline. Black stone in South Africa, monument that played a dedication to all non-human lives caught in the war. And all children still brought flowers to parks a glass wall in Florida, infuriatingly alive and unchanged by the dignity of projection of eyes continued above the waterline. Every Pacific monument human veterans like low whale song tones under the names classes of on dozens of worlds. Now children still brought flowers of the conflict under a single infuriatingly alive when Galactic Invaders met the dignity of wildlife culture. Massacre continued attacking. It is not entirely precise, of course. Human veterans like human soldiers bled and history classes on dozens of worlds now teach the opening phase of the conflict under a single title. Earth did not win Galactic Invaders alone ate wildlife. The massacre began. Because it is not entirely hated armored columns, of course, or because human soldiers bled and died in impossible numbers. Earth won because humans understood what kind of planet had made them. Oceans were scarred. Unlike the invaders, Earth did not win because crocodiles alone ate a few arrogant. They did not stand above nature. Because elephants hated armored columns inside it. Because and with the terrible practical humility of a species, Earth won because humans understood what kind of planet had made them. Survive us. Unlike the invaders, any invaders they were stupid enough to underestimate Earth's wildlife. They did not stand to make it home. They fought beside it, inside it, and with the terrible practical humility of a species that knew the truth from the start. If Earth could survive us, then any invader stupid enough to underestimate Earth's wildlife was never going to make it home whole.